The cruelest thing in the galaxy wasn't slavery. It was watching someone forget they deserved to be free. The slave market of Outpost Kepri smelled like burnt coolant, recycled sweat, and old metal left too long beneath failing heaters. Massive ventilation fans groaned overhead, pushing stale air through the crowded docking station, while neon auction signs flickered across rusted walls in fading shades of crimson and blue. Captain Ethan Graves stepped through the sea of bodies with the tired expression of a man who had spent too many years drifting between stars that all looked the same. His heavy brown coat hung loose over broad shoulders hardened by decades in cargo routes and border conflicts. A faded scar crossed the edge of his jaw beneath several days of dark stubble, and exhaustion sat deep behind his gray eyes. The soles of his boots scraped against grated steel flooring as announcements echoed through the station in 6 different languages. Docking Bay 12 now accepting outbound freight registration. Mining contracts available for verified crews. Final bidding begins in 4 minutes. Ethan ignored most of it. He only wanted his payment, a bottle of something strong, and enough sleep to forget the last 14 months hauling industrial equipment through pirate territory. The market corridor narrowed ahead, forcing him closer to the central auction platform, whether he wanted it or not. He muttered under his breath when he realized where the crowd was gathering. Slave auctions. Damn station always put the worst businesses nearest the docks. He adjusted the worn leather gloves on his hands and kept moving, eyes forward. Don't stop. Don't look. Not your problem. Then he heard the chains. The sound cut through the station, noise sharper than the auctioneer's amplified voice. Metal dragging slowly across steel. Ethan glanced sideways before he could stop himself. A line of alien prisoners stood beneath harsh white floodlights on a raised platform surrounded by armed brokers in gray uniforms. Most kept their heads lowered. Some looked terrified. Others looked empty. But one of them stared directly at the crowd with quiet hatred burning behind. Luminous violet eyes. She stood taller than the others despite the restraint collar around her throat and the silver chains binding her wrists. Her pale blue skin caught the overhead lights like moonlight reflecting across deep water, and long strands of silver hair hung loose around her shoulders in tangled waves. The electronic tag attached to her collar flashed foreign symbols Ethan couldn't read. The broker beside her shoved her shoulder aggressively when she refused to bow her head. "Lower your eyes," the broker snapped. She didn't move. Ethan should have walked away then. Instead, he slowed. Something about the way she stood there felt wrong. Not weak. Not defeated. Just tired in a way he recognized too well. The broker grabbed her arm harder this time, trying to force compliance for the buyers circling the platform. Defiant Valorian female. The auctioneer announced through crackling speakers. Healthy. Educated. Rare genetics. Suitable for domestic companionship, translation services, or diplomatic acquisition. A few people laughed. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. The girl remained silent. One wealthy trader near the platform stepped forward and reached toward her face with casual disrespect, examining her like damaged merchandise sitting on a shelf. That was when she reacted. Fast. She jerked her head away violently enough to make the chains rattle and stared at the man with such cold fury that even the crowd quieted for half a second. The trader scoffed. "Careful," he sneered. "You should feel lucky someone still sees value in you." Ethan looked away immediately and started walking again. "Not your business, Graves." He repeated it inside his head like a prayer he no longer believed in. But behind him, over the noise of engines and distant cargo lifts, he heard the sharp crackle of an activated restraint collar followed by a soft gasp that sounded far too human. Ethan kept walking for another 20 feet before stopping beside a flickering cargo terminal near Docking Bay 12. The station lights buzzed faintly overhead while freight drones rolled past on magnetic tracks carrying containers stacked higher than a pickup truck. He stood there, motionless, gloved hands resting against the cold metal railing as ships thundered somewhere beyond the docking walls. The sound of the restraint collar still echoed inside his head. He hated that sound, not because it was loud, because he remembered it. Different station, different war, different people he failed to help. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose and closed his tired eyes for half a second. "Damn it," he muttered. He turned around. The crowd near the auction platform had thinned slightly now that higher-value buyers were making private offers. Neon signs flashed, rotating prices above the captives while armed security officers watched from elevated catwalks. Ethan pushed his way back through the market with the expression of a man already regretting his decision. The blue-skinned girl remained exactly where he had left her, still standing straight, still refusing to lower her gaze. A faint red mark glowed along the side of her neck beneath the restraint collar where the punishment pulse had triggered earlier. The auctioneer noticed Ethan approaching and instantly forced a salesman's smile onto his narrow face. "Captain," the man said smoothly, recognizing the freighter insignia stitched onto Ethan's coat. "Interested in making a purchase tonight?" Ethan ignored the question at first and studied the girl more closely. Up close, she looked exhausted. Tiny fractures lined the silver restraints around her wrists, evidence she had probably fought them until her strength gave out. Her silver hair partially hid one side of her face, but her eyes remained fixed on him with guarded suspicion. Not fear. Never fear. "What is she charged with?" Ethan asked flatly. The broker laughed lightly. "Nothing so dramatic. War displacement. Debt inheritance. Standard processing from the Veiler systems." Ethan knew that answer was garbage. Nobody with posture like hers came from simple debt labor. "How much?" The broker's smile widened immediately. "Expensive taste, Captain. She is educated, genetically verified, multilingual, and classified upper tier." He tapped numbers into a datapad before turning the screen around. Ethan stared at the price and almost laughed. "You. Trying to buy your own station. Quality costs money." Ethan looked back at the girl. She finally spoke for the first time, her voice low and rough from dehydration. "Do not waste your credits." The broker snapped his fingers irritably. Silence. But Ethan kept his eyes on her. "You got a name?" A small pause followed, like she had not heard that question in a very long time. "Lyra." Her voice barely rose above the hum of the station. "Lyra Vale." Ethan nodded once. Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out a worn credit chip attached to a chain around his neck. The broker's eyes lit up immediately when he saw the account authorization level. "Captain, now we are speaking seriously." Ethan placed the chip onto the metal counter harder than necessary. "Transfer ownership and remove the collar." Lyra's expression shifted for the first time. Not relief. Confusion. Genuine confusion. The broker quickly processed the transaction while nearby buyers whispered among themselves. Ethan could feel their stares crawling across his back. One man chuckled quietly. Freighter captain bought himself a pet. Another laughed. Ethan ignored them. He always ignored people like that. The broker finally deactivated the restraint system with an electronic chirp. The heavy collar unlocked around Lyra's throat and dropped into the auctioneer's hand with a dull metallic clank. Red pressure marks remained against her pale blue skin where the metal had rested too long. Ethan picked up the small release key from the counter and tossed it toward her. Lyra caught it instinctively despite the chains still binding her wrists. She stared down at the key resting in her palms as if it weighed more than the restraints themselves. Ethan adjusted his coat and turned toward the docking corridor. "My ship leaves in 20 minutes, he said without looking back. "You can stay here if you want." For several silent seconds, all Ethan heard behind him was the distant hum of engines and the soft rattle of chains slowly hitting the floor. The corridor leading toward Docking Bay 12 felt colder than the rest of the station. Old fluorescent strips flickered overhead behind protective wire cages, while steam drifted from exposed coolant pipes running along the ceiling. Ethan walked without checking whether Lyra followed him. He kept one hand buried inside his coat pocket and the other wrapped around a small data tablet displaying cargo invoices he had no interest in reading anymore. Behind him came the faint metallic sound of loose chains brushing softly against fabric with each careful step. She was following. Of course she was. Outpost Kepri was not the kind of station where a freed captive survived long alone. The docking bay doors groaned open as Ethan approached. Beyond them sat his freighter, the Wayfairer, resting on heavy landing struts beneath industrial floodlights. The ship looked every bit like a machine held together by stubbornness and repair patches. Scratches scarred the dark hull plating, old burn marks stained the engine vents, and one exterior cargo panel sat half a shade darker than the rest after a rushed replacement job near Titan Route 7. Lyra slowed when she saw it. "That is your vessel?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced back once. Unfortunately, the faintest expression touched her face. Not quite amusement. Maybe surprise. He climbed the loading ramp first while hydraulic systems hissed beneath heavy boots. The interior of the freighter smelled like coffee grounds, engine grease, and recycled air filters overdue for replacement. Soft amber lights illuminated narrow steel corridors lined with storage crates and exposed wiring bundles running overhead like tangled veins. Ethan tossed his coat across the back of a chair near the cockpit entrance and activated the ship's systems. Consoles flickered awake one by one, casting pale blue reflections across the cabin walls. Dock control, Ethan muttered into the comm system. Freighter Wayfairer requesting departure clearance. Static crackled briefly before a board operator answered. Departure approved. Exit lane 4. Try not to explode this time, Graves. Ethan smirked faintly. No promises. He shut off the channel and turned around. Lyra still stood near the cargo ramp entrance without moving farther inside. The broken slave chains remained hanging loosely from one wrist because she had only unlocked one side. Ethan noticed immediately. There is a cutter in the med bay cabinet, he said while adjusting navigation coordinates. Second door on the left. She did not move. You are allowing me unrestricted access to your ship? It is not exactly a battleship. That is not what I asked. Ethan finally looked at her directly. Under the warmer ship lighting, the exhaustion in her face became clearer. Dark shadows rested beneath her glowing violet eyes, and the faint restraint marks around her throat stood out sharply against pale blue skin. She looked like someone waiting for the trap hidden beneath kindness. Ethan recognized that look too. Lyra, he said carefully. If I wanted a prisoner, I would have left the collar on. Silence settled between them beneath the steady hum of engine turbines warming for departure. Somewhere deeper in the ship, an old ventilation fan rattled unevenly every few seconds. Lyra lowered her gaze briefly toward the unlocked restraint hanging from her wrist. Most humans do not spend that much money simply to be charitable. Ethan leaned back against the navigation console. Most humans are idiots. Another small silence followed. Then, very slowly, she walked farther into the ship. Her movements remained cautious, shoulders tense beneath the oversized gray station blanket someone at the auction had thrown around her earlier. She disappeared down the corridor toward the med bay while Ethan focused on launch procedures. Outside the forward viewport, massive docking clamps disengaged from the hull with heavy metallic thunks. The Wayfarer trembled softly as engines powered higher. Ethan watched cargo crews scatter across the bay floor while warning lights flashed amber through rising steam clouds. Then he heard it, a quiet metallic clink behind him. He turned slightly. The final restraint chain rested on the floor outside the med bay doorway. Lyra stood beside it silently, rubbing the faint marks around her wrist as though she no longer remembered what it felt like to move freely. Ethan looked at the discarded chain for a long moment before returning his attention to the stars waiting beyond the station shield. You should get some sleep, he said. Lyra studied him carefully from across the corridor. People do not usually sleep safely on ships they were purchased on. Ethan's hands paused briefly above the controls. His expression darkened in a way she could not fully read. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. The Wayfarer drifted quietly through deep space 3 hours after leaving Outpost Kepri. Outside the forward viewport, endless stars stretched across the darkness like scattered ice floating on black water. The ship's engines produced a low mechanical hum beneath the floor panels, steady and familiar, the kind of sound that eventually blended into silence after enough years living among machines. Ethan sat alone in the cockpit with one boot resting against the console edge while navigation data scrolled slowly across dim holographic displays. A half-empty cup of burnt coffee cooled beside his hand. He had not touched it in 20 minutes. His attention kept drifting toward the hallway leading deeper into the ship. Lyra had barely spoken since boarding. That was probably smart. People survived longer by staying quiet around strangers, especially strangers who bought them from chains. Ethan rubbed tired fingers across his jaw and checked fuel consumption again simply to keep his mind occupied. Everything on the freighter worked exactly the way it should for once, which somehow made the silence feel louder. Then he heard soft footsteps approaching through the corridor. He glanced up instinctively. Lyra stopped near the cockpit entrance without fully stepping inside. The oversized gray blanket still hung loosely around her shoulders, though now her silver hair looked cleaner after using the med bay sink. She had washed dried blood from the side of her neck where the restraint collar had burned her earlier. The red mark remained faintly visible beneath the warm cockpit lighting. Ethan nodded toward the empty seat beside the navigation panel. You can sit if you want. Lyra hesitated before lowering herself carefully into the chair. Her movements stayed tense, controlled, like someone expecting the room itself to betray her eventually. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The ship carried them forward through the stars while distant systems blinked silently across the glass. Finally, Lyra's eyes shifted toward the coffee beside him. That smells terrible. Ethan looked down at the cup. It tastes worse. To his surprise, the corner of her mouth moved slightly upward. It vanished almost immediately, but Ethan noticed. There is tea in storage compartment 3, he said. Unless humans ruined that too. Another faint trace of amusement touched her expression before disappearing beneath caution again. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair without answering right away. He had known the question was coming eventually. Everyone asked eventually. Even the people who already knew the answer. I had credits, he said at last. Lyra watched him carefully. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. She lowered her gaze briefly toward her hands resting in her lap. Her wrists still carried faint marks from the restraints despite the med gel she had applied earlier. People do not spend fortunes on strangers without expecting something in return. Ethan stared out at the stars beyond the viewport. Maybe I am just bad with money. You are avoiding the question. You are alive, Ethan replied quietly. That should be enough for tonight. Silence settled between them again, softer this time. Somewhere behind the cockpit walls, old pipes clicked gently as heat cycled through the ship's systems. Lyra slowly turned her attention toward the stars outside. Ethan noticed the way her expression changed when she looked at open space. Not fear. Grief. You have been far from home a long time, he said. She glanced at him sharply. How would you know that? Ethan shrugged once. Same look people get after too many years drifting. Lyra remained silent for several seconds. Then she spoke so softly he almost missed it. Wayfairer had silver oceans. Ethan looked toward her. Sounds expensive. It was beautiful. The words carried something fragile beneath them. Memory. Loss. Ethan did not push further. Some wounds closed slower when touched. Instead, he reached forward and adjusted the ship controls. As the freighter entered a calmer trade lane. There is a spare cabin 2 doors down from the med bay, he said. Lock works from the inside if that makes you feel better. Lyra studied him carefully again, trying to understand something that refused to fit inside her understanding of people. You trust me alone on your ship? Ethan finally picked up the cold coffee and grimaced after taking a sip. Lyra, he muttered, this ship barely trusts me. For the first time since leaving the station, a quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Small, brief, but real. And somehow, inside the endless cold of space, that sound made the old freighter feel a little less empty. The artificial night cycle dimmed the ship lights to a softer amber around midnight ship time. Most of the Wayfairer fell quiet except for the endless mechanical heartbeat buried deep beneath the floor panels. Engines vibrated steadily through the metal hull, while cooling systems whispered through narrow vents overhead. Ethan sat alone at the small galley table near the cockpit wearing a faded black thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed halfway up his forearms. A repair kit lay scattered across the table beside an opened engine schematic glowing faintly blue across his tablet screen. He had been pretending to fix the same faulty power relay for almost an hour. Truth was, he could not sleep. Not tonight. Maybe not after hearing someone laugh on his ship for the first time in months. He tightened a connector unnecessarily before realizing he had already repaired it 20 minutes earlier. You are terrible at pretending to work. Lyra's voice drifted softly from the hallway entrance. Ethan glanced up. She stood there wearing one of the spare crew jackets he had left outside her cabin earlier. The dark fabric hung loose around her frame, sleeves extending past her hands slightly. Her silver hair remained damp from another attempt to wash station grime away, and under the lower lighting her pale blue skin almost seemed to glow softly against the steel walls. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You were supposed to be sleeping. So are you. Fair point. Lyra stepped farther into the galley slowly, eyes moving across the scattered tools and exposed relay components. You are fixing something that already functions. Ethan looked down at the repaired part and sighed quietly. Caught me. She approached the table carefully, still moving with the instinctive caution of someone who had learned not to relax around strangers. But the tension around her shoulders had softened slightly since leaving the station. Not gone, just quieter. Ethan noticed things like that. He always noticed things people try to hide. Lyra studied the old schematic glowing across the table. You repaired the cooling manifolds manually? 3 weeks ago. Without dock assistance? Dock assistance costs money. Another faint look appeared in her eyes, somewhere between disbelief and reluctant admiration. This vessel should not still be operational. Ethan smirked faintly. That is the nicest thing anybody has ever said about her. Lyra glanced toward the small heating unit built into the galley wall. What is that smell? Soup. Humans make soup that smells like engine coolant? Ethan stood and walked toward the heating unit while rubbing one tired hand across the back of his neck. Depends how desperate the human is. He grabbed 2 dented metal bowls from the storage cabinet overhead and filled them carefully from the steaming container inside the warmer. The scent of vegetables, broth, and too much black pepper spread gently through the room. Nothing fancy, just survival food improved by habit. He placed one bowl in front of her. Lyra stared at it suspiciously. It is not poisoned. You sound offended that I considered the possibility. I am offended you think I would waste good soup. For a second, another quiet laugh escaped her before she lowered herself slowly into the seat across from him. They ate in silence at first while the ship drifted through endless darkness outside. Ethan watched distant stars reflect faintly in the viewport behind her shoulder. Lyra held the warm bowl carefully between both hands like she had forgotten what it felt like to hold something meant purely for comfort. After several minutes, she finally spoke again. The station broker said humans only buy? Slaves for labor or pleasure. Ethan's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The ship suddenly felt much quieter. Yeah, he said carefully. A lot of people do. Lyra looked down into the soup rather than at him. Then why did you buy me? Ethan remained silent long enough for the engines to fill the space between them. Finally, he set the spoon down gently beside the bowl. Because somebody should have bought your freedom before chains ever touched you. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly around the warm metal bowl. Ethan could see confusion moving behind her glowing violet eyes again. Not because she doubted him. Because part of her wanted to believe him now. And that frightened her more than the chains ever did. Outside the viewport, starlight drifted silently across the glass while 2 strangers sat beneath tired amber lights, sharing bad soup in the middle of nowhere. The next morning began with alarms. Sharp electronic beeps cut through the quiet interior of the Wayfairer, while red warning lights pulsed faintly across the cockpit walls. Ethan jerked awake in the pilot chair with one hand already reaching instinctively toward the old pulse pistol secured beneath the console before his tired brain caught up with reality. Navigation alerts flashed rapidly across the main screen. Unregistered scan detected. Long-range signature lock. Ethan muttered something under his breath and wiped sleep from his eyes while quickly pulling up the sensor feed. 3 ships. Small. Fast. Running dark signatures to avoid identification. His jaw tightened immediately. That is not good. Footsteps sounded from the corridor behind him only seconds later. Lyra appeared in the cockpit doorway wearing the oversized crew jacket again, silver hair slightly disheveled from sleep. The flashing red lights reflected softly across her pale blue skin, while concern sharpened her features. What happened? Ethan's fingers moved quickly across the controls. Company. He enlarged the sensor display. 3 triangular blips drifted closer behind them through the trade lane. Too deliberate to be coincidence. Pirates? She asked quietly. Ethan stared at the screen for another second before answering. Worse. Lyra understood immediately. Her expression changed in a way Ethan hated seeing. Not panic. Resignation. The kind people carried when they believed trouble always found them eventually. The syndicate tracked the purchase authorization, she said softly. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. Looks like it. The Wayfarer vibrated lightly as he pushed more power into the engines. Old machinery groaned beneath the sudden strain, while fuel indicators shifted downward faster than he liked. One of the engine manifolds flashed yellow across the diagnostic panel. Come on, Ethan muttered under his breath. Do not embarrass me now. Lyra stepped closer to the navigation display. Your ship cannot outrun them. That is a very rude thing to say before breakfast. It is also true. Ethan glanced sideways at her. Even now, exhausted and hunted, there remained something painfully composed about her. Like dignity had become instinct after everything else was stripped away. The proximity alarm beeped again. Closer this time. Ethan's expression hardened. Get to the lower corridor. Lyra did not move. Ethan. Lyra. His voice sharpened slightly for the first time since they met. Please. She studied him carefully for a long moment before finally stepping farther into the cockpit instead of leaving. No, Ethan blinked once. No. You purchased my freedom. I did not purchase your death. Something about the sentence hit harder than he expected. Ethan looked back toward the viewport where distant stars stretched endlessly ahead of them. Nobody is dying today. You do not know that. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I know. The comm system crackled suddenly with incoming transmission static. Then a rough male voice filled the cockpit speakers. Freighter Wayfairer, reduce engine output and prepare for boarding inspection. Ethan rolled his eyes immediately. At least they are pretending to be polite. Lyra's face lost color beneath the blue tint of her skin. Ethan noticed. Hey. She looked toward him. You are not going back there. For a second, neither of them spoke. The engines hummed louder as Ethan pushed the ship harder through open space. Outside the viewport, stars blurred faintly from acceleration strain. Lyra lowered her voice carefully. If they only want me, surrendering would keep you alive. Ethan stared straight ahead at the controls without answering immediately. Then he reached forward and manually disabled the external docking protocols. Warning symbols flashed red across the console, confirming the lockout. Ethan, I spent half my life watching people decide somebody else was not worth saving, he said quietly. I am getting real tired of it. The cockpit fell silent except for engine vibration and distant warning alarms. Lyra looked at him differently after that. Not like a rescuer. Not like an owner. Like someone she no longer fully understood. And somehow, that frightened her even more. Another proximity alert sounded. Much closer now. Ethan tightened both hands around the controls while the old freighter rattled violently beneath them. Then, very softly, Lyra asked the question she had been holding back since the moment he bought her freedom. What happened to you? Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the stars ahead. Nothing special, he said. But the sadness in his voice told her that was a lie. The Wayfarer shook violently as another proximity alarm screamed through the cockpit. Ethan tightened his grip on the controls while engine temperatures climbed dangerously across the console display. Outside the forward viewport, 3 dark ships cut through the stars behind them like hunting animals closing distance with patient confidence. Their running lights remained off. Professional. Organized. Ethan hated organized people. Distance? Lyra asked quietly. Ethan checked the scanner. Too close. The old freighter groaned again when he forced more power into the engines. Warning symbols flashed across half the dashboard now, bathing the cockpit in nervous red light. One of the coolant systems hissed loudly somewhere beneath the floor. Ethan glanced toward the overhead panel. Please hold together for another 10 minutes, he muttered to the ship. Lyra watched him carefully. You speak to the vessel often? Only when she is threatening to explode. Another transmission burst through the speakers. Freighter Wayfarer, cut engine output immediately. Ethan shut the channel off without answering. Lyra moved closer beside the pilot console, silver hair catching flashes of crimson warning light as she looked over the navigation screen. They are hurting us. Ethan already knew. The 3 ships behind them had slowly shifted formation, forcing the Wayfarer toward a dead section of trade space with no nearby patrol routes. No witnesses. Smart move. They think I scare easy, Ethan said. Do you? He gave her a tired sideways glance. Not until the second cup of coffee. A faint smile touched her expression before fading again beneath worry. The ship rattled violently as another sensor lock warning blared through the cockpit. Ethan's jaw tightened. All right, he said quietly. New plan. He reached across the control panel and opened a hidden compartment beneath the navigation console. Inside rested an old silver data drive attached to a worn military chain. Lyra noticed the way his expression changed when he picked it up. Careful. Heavy. Like memory weighed more than metal. Ethan pressed the drive into her hand. If something goes wrong, you take the emergency shuttle. Lyra immediately shook her head. No, Lyra. No. Her voice sharpened unexpectedly. I will not abandon you. Ethan blinked once at the intensity behind the words. For a moment, neither moved. Then he leaned back slowly in the pilot chair and exhaled through his nose. You barely know me. Lyra looked down at the data drive resting in her palm. I know enough. The cockpit fell quiet except for warning alarms and engine vibration. Ethan studied her face carefully beneath the red emergency lights. The fear was still there. He could see it. But now something else existed beside it. Trust. Small. Fragile. Dangerous. Another violent tremor ran through the freighter. Ethan looked back toward the controls. Hold on. He slammed a sequence into the navigation panel and suddenly killed the main engine thrust completely. The Wayfairer lurched hard as momentum shifted. Lyra grabbed the edge of the console to steady herself. What are you doing? Something stupid. The stars outside rotated sharply. When Ethan forced the freighter into a sudden downward spin beneath the nearest debris field floating near the trade lane. Massive chunks of frozen mining wreckage drifted silently ahead, some larger than apartment buildings. The pursuing ships overshot slightly before adjusting course. Ethan's hands moved quickly across the controls while sweat formed along his brow. Come on, he muttered. Come on. The old freighter screamed beneath the strain. Warning sirens blended with grinding metal somewhere deep inside the hull. Lyra stared at him. Your ship cannot survive this. Neither can theirs if they get cocky. The debris field swallowed them seconds later. Darkness and drifting steel surrounded the cockpit, while fractured wreckage spun past the viewport close enough for Ethan to see old scorch marks across abandoned hull fragments. One wrong move would tear the Wayfairer apart. Ethan guided the freighter through the maze with frightening precision despite the ship shaking around them. Lyra watched him in stunned silence. The exhausted cargo captain who joked about soup and broken engines suddenly moved like someone trained for war long ago. Another alarm sounded. One of the pursuing ships clipped debris behind them. A burst of static exploded across the sensors before vanishing completely from the scanner. Ethan did not celebrate. He only kept flying. Ethan, Lyra said softly. He did not look away from the controls. Yeah. She tightened her fingers slightly around the old military data drive, still resting in her hand. Whatever happened to you? Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. It did not destroy the good parts. Ethan's hands paused very briefly over the controls. Outside the viewport, cold stars drifted silently beyond shattered metal, while the old freighter carried two wounded souls deeper into the dark. The debris field finally thinned after nearly 20 minutes of dangerous drifting through shattered wreckage and frozen metal carcasses left behind by old mining convoys. The Wayfarer emerged back into open space, trailing coolant vapor from an overloaded side manifold, while warning indicators flashed across nearly every panel in the cockpit. Ethan leaned heavily against the controls, breathing slower now that the immediate danger had passed. One of the pursuing ships remained on scanners far behind them, damaged but stubbornly continuing the chase. The other two had vanished from the sensor grid entirely. Lyra sat quietly beside him, both hands wrapped around the old military data drive he had given her earlier. She had not let go of it once. The red emergency lights inside the cockpit had finally dimmed back to normal amber tones, leaving soft shadows across the steel walls and tired faces. Ethan rubbed both hands over his eyes before checking the fuel readout again. His expression darkened immediately. That bad? Lyra asked softly. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Depends how much you enjoy drifting forever through empty space. The evasive maneuver through the debris field had burned far more fuel than planned. Worse, one of the jump stabilizers now showed critical damage from overheating. The Wayfarer could still fly. Barely. But long-range travel was no longer safe. Ethan leaned back slowly in the pilot chair while the old freighter creaked around them like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. Nearest safe station is 12 hours away, he muttered. Maybe 14 if the engines decide to hate me personally. Lyra looked toward the sensor display where the remaining ship still followed at extreme distance. They will not stop. No, Ethan's voice remained calm. Too calm. That worried her more. Silence settled briefly while stars drifted across the viewport like distant frozen fire. Then Lyra finally placed the military data drive carefully onto the console between them. You should know why they are hunting me. Ethan glanced at the drive, but did not touch it. Only if you want to tell me. She looked surprised by the answer. Again, Ethan noticed that happened a lot around him lately. Lyra turned her attention back toward the stars before speaking quietly. My father served on the Valorian High Council before the border wars. Ethan's expression sharpened slightly. Even human cargo captains knew that name. The Valorian High Council controlled trade routes across half the outer systems before political collapse shattered their government years earlier. You are council-born? Ethan asked. Lyra nodded faintly. My family negotiated ceasefires between worlds for generations. Her voice remained steady at first, but sadness slowly crept beneath the words. When the war expanded, some factions decided diplomacy had become inconvenient. Ethan understood immediately. You were targeted. My father was executed publicly. The cockpit grew very quiet after that. Only the low hum of engines filled the silence. Lyra kept staring out the viewport while speaking, as though looking directly at Ethan might make the memories harder to survive. Our transport was attacked during evacuation. I was separated from the others and sold through multiple systems before arriving at Khepri. Ethan's jaw tightened slowly. And the syndicate recognized who you were. Lyra lowered her gaze. Not entirely. They only knew I carried information worth protecting. Ethan finally picked up the old data drive from the console and turned it carefully in his hand. This is not military service records, is it? Lyra shook her head once. No. Her glowing violet eyes met his fully now. It contains encrypted negotiation archives from the final weeks before the war expanded. Evidence against several governments. Human governments included. Ethan stared at the drive silently. Suddenly everything made much more sense. The pursuit, the money, the desperation. Lyra watched the realization settle across his tired face. You could still leave me, she said softly. Destroy the drive. Save yourself. Ethan looked down at the small silver device resting in his palm. Then he looked back toward her. You still think I bought you because I wanted something? Everyone always wants something. Ethan studied her for a long moment before answering quietly. Yeah. His voice softened. But sometimes what people want is for someone else to stop hurting. Lyra's breath caught almost invisibly. Ethan handed the drive back to her gently. No hesitation. No bargaining. Just trust. Real trust. The kind she had almost forgotten existed. Outside the viewport, cold starlight reflected faintly in her eyes while the damaged freighter drifted onward through endless darkness, carrying secrets powerful enough to start wars or end them forever. The nearest relay station appeared 6 hours later as a distant cluster of silver lights suspended against the darkness like a fragile lantern floating in an endless ocean. Port Meridian was small by interstellar standards, barely more than a refueling platform wrapped around a communications hub, but to Ethan it looked beautiful. The Wayfairer limped toward the station on failing stabilizers, while warning indicators flickered weakly across the cockpit. One engine had shut down entirely 40 minutes earlier. The remaining systems sounded exhausted. Honestly, so did Ethan. He sat slouched forward in the pilot chair with rolled sleeves and grease stains across both hands after spending most of the journey manually balancing power flow beneath the engine deck. Lyra stood quietly behind him, holding 2 fresh cups of coffee she had somehow managed to make even worse than his. Ethan took one sip and winced immediately. That is aggressive. A faint smile touched her lips. I followed your instructions exactly. That explains it. Outside the viewport, docking lights guided them slowly toward the station entrance, while automated traffic signals blinked soft blue through the darkness. The remaining syndicate ship still lingered somewhere behind them, but at a greater distance now. Careful. Waiting. Ethan knew the type. Predators who preferred easier kills. He finally leaned back in the chair with a long, tired breath. Once we dock, there is a secured diplomatic office on Meridian. Lyra's expression tightened slightly. You are turning me over to the authorities. Ethan glanced back toward her. I am getting you somewhere safe. Those are not always the same thing. Fair point. Ethan looked down at the cracked navigation screen glowing faintly beneath his hand. The council archives on that drive deserve protection. So do you. Lyra studied him carefully in the soft cockpit lighting. And what happens to you afterward? Ethan shrugged lightly. Probably repairs. Definitely expensive repairs. She almost smiled again. Almost. But sadness still lingered behind it now. Docking clamps finally locked around the Wayfarer with a heavy metallic thud that echoed gently through the hull. The ship settled into silence except for cooling systems ticking softly behind the walls. For the first time in days, there were no alarms. No warnings. No pursuit signals screaming through the cockpit. Just stillness. Ethan powered down the final engine and slowly stood from the pilot chair with a quiet groan in his back. Getting old, he muttered. Lyra looked at him for a long moment before speaking carefully. On Valor, there is an old belief. Ethan grabbed his worn coat from the console chair. Yeah. The stars guide wounded people toward each other before they guide them home. Ethan paused briefly. Sounds poetic. It sounds unrealistic. He glanced toward her. And yet here we are. Silence settled gently between them while station lights reflected across the cockpit glass. Lyra looked down at the old military data drive resting safely inside her hand. Then, very slowly, she reached into the pocket of the oversized crew jacket she still wore and removed something else. The small restraint key from the auction platform. Ethan stared at it quietly. She placed it down beside the darkened navigation console with careful fingers. The tiny piece of metal made almost no sound at all. I kept it because I thought freedom could be taken back at any moment, she admitted softly. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the cockpit doorway. And now, Lyra's glowing violet eyes met his fully. There was no fear left in them now, only something warmer, something human. Now I think freedom may be the first thing anyone ever gave me without asking for part of me in return. Ethan looked away first, suddenly uncomfortable with emotions he had spent years avoiding. He cleared his throat roughly and grabbed the emergency repair kit near the hatch. Well, he muttered quietly, you still owe me for the engine manifold. A soft laugh escaped her again. Real this time. Bright enough to make the old freighter feel alive beneath the cold station lights. Ethan stepped toward the exit hatch and stopped beside her for only a second. Not long. Just enough. Lyra. Yes. He glanced toward the stars beyond the viewport one last time. Nobody owns you anymore. Her breath caught softly at the words. Ethan opened the hatch and station lights spilled across the worn steel floor, while distant voices echoed through the docking corridor outside. Lyra remained standing beside the pilot console for a moment longer, watching the tired human captain disappear into the glow beyond the ship. Then she looked down at the discarded restraint key resting alone against cold metal. And for the first time in many years, the universe no longer felt like a cage.